think I've got the thing on. Hi, Terry.
Hello, how are you?
Great. It's great to see you.
Can you see me? Good.
Yeah, I can see you. I don't think the reverse is true.
No, we can't see you, but it's great to hear your voice.
Yeah. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm really looking forward to hearing this story.
Well, I hope I can meet your expectations.
You will. No. So how have things been?
We would wish for a little more water in our system, but all in all, I think things are going well. All the work that we've done, including work with you, Balaji, of course, more recently, but it's all come to fruition. In fact, we're sitting right next to the room where our water operations department works, and many of the tools that you and Balaji others helped us develop are being utilized as we speak.
That's wonderful.
So it's been a great 20 plus years, and it sure went by fast, I'd say.
Right. So, let me see here. I think somebody is going to manage this, so because I am not completely sure that I don't think I have the control of the thing, but I'm able to talk to you, so that's good.
So, Dr. Law, this is Angela Adams here with Dr. Fulp, and Lisa and I are going to do collaborative control. She's handling some things on your end, and I'm handling some things on this end.
Okay, so you'll control it, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And just don't go full screen. Once you're done, mute your phone.
Okay, I'll just mute it here on this. Okay.
I think you need to, are you connected through your computer?
Only through the computer.
Okay, perfect.
So Terry, we generally start at 5 after because people keep rolling in.
That is no problem at all.
Hey, Lisa, could you move the video box up just a little bit? It's obscuring the upper portion of the chat on our screen. Thank you very much.
Wow, technology. Amazing.
Sorry, I had my phone on mute. You can hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, yeah, it's like, there's like 36 of them.
Other people having audio, or is that disabled or do we mute it? I think there's a shortcut to mute all these people. I'm not getting the option.
Okay, guys, let's start. I'm Mukmanu Lal. I'm at Columbia University, and it's my pleasure to welcome Terry Fulp and all of you to today's webinar. There's Terry waving, as you can see in the top right window. This webinar series is in collaboration with Quasi and the US Water Partnership, so we are grateful to them for helping us launch it. It's also part of the America's Water Initiative that we've been developing at Columbia, and part of it is funded by the National Science Foundation under a Water Sustainability Climate Grant. So very quickly, what we are trying to do is to get an understanding of the value water provides to America's economy, and how the evolution of water infrastructure and groundwater use in the past has actually enabled different sectors of the economy to develop across the country. And as going forward, what we are trying to build is a model in addition to diagnostic analyses on the past. And the model looks at a capacity expansion of all sorts of infrastructure, water, energy, and agriculture, relative to climate at a county scale across the whole United States. So we are looking at policy scenarios as well as various other things. but that's not what today is about, other than giving you context, because we are trying to understand from the speakers in this webinar, such as Terry, what are we really trying to do, and what are the possible implications. So today's talk on the evolution of water policy on the Colorado by Terry is an amazing one. In that we've all heard of the issues in the West with regard to water, and we are trying to understand exactly how this has evolved. And there is not a better person than Terry Fulp to do this. I've known Terry for 20 plus years now, I think. He's one of the first people who decided that it was a singular mission to transform the Bureau of Reclamation into an agency that was not only supporting research, but also mapping that research actively into its mandate. And I've been really, really impressed by what he's managed to accomplish over the years, starting from optimization models for operating the system to a wide breadth of integration of paleoclimate and policy into them. So I welcome him to our webinar, and I'm sure that all of us will be enriched by what he has to tell us. Terry, all yours.
Okay, very good. I hope everyone can hear. If there is a problem, I think for you all on the webinar, you can send us a note and we'll try to deal with that. Manu, I just want to start out by saying thank you very much for the great introduction. It is amazing how quick 25 to 30 years goes, doesn't it? I'm always quite amazed by what small amounts of time we relatively have, each and every one of us, in terms of affecting policy, particularly complex policies like we're going to talk about today. Before I start, I hope you can see on the webinar there is 3 very large books sitting here, and those are 30-year snapshots of this thing called the Law of the River on the Colorado River. So now that I've impressed you with the volume of them, I'm going to set them behind me, because our goal today is to not go through that voluminous set of documents. It's really to talk about how this Law of the River has evolved over time. And I think it's really important because many people will view a regulatory and legal framework like we have on the Colorado River as something that's very static. And in fact, often people ask us to throw it out, start over. And my thesis here is not going to be that. In fact, I believe the thesis is that this Law of the River has evolved sufficiently over time, and I'm going to hopefully convince you of that. And the real question is, what should its evolution be over the next 50 years in order to adapt both quickly enough and resiliently enough to changing conditions on this river system, including those conditions that are driven by climate change. So I've got a few minutes to try to convince you of this. We'll definitely leave some time for questions and dialogue at the end. So with that, let's get started. So we'll start with a map. This is a map of the Colorado River Basin. And I'm not sure if this mouse is going to be seen. Do you think the folks can see it? Manu, can you see us moving the mouse on the screen? And you might be on mute.
I'm not seeing that, sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah,
we were wondering whether that... Okay, so that's fine. We won't rely on a pointer. We'll talk to you a little bit with the graphics. So this is first an outline of the Colorado River Basin. Starts in the headwaters of Wyoming and Upper Colorado, just west of Denver itself, and goes all the way down to the bottom into the Sea of Cortez with the border of Mexico. It is a large basin relative to the drainage area. It's also a very productive basin relative to water supply, but of course pales in comparison to the big river basins in the Midwest and East, like the Mississippi River. There's been a lot of development over time on this river basin, and particularly outside the basin boundaries. And hopefully you can see, if you go up to the northeast part of the basin boundary, you could see Denver And the amount of water that's service areas, as we call them, where water is being transmitted through the Continental Divide to serve the Front Range of Colorado. You also see a similar thing in New Mexico, and certainly if you go down to the lower left side, you see a lot of water use outside the actual hydrologic basin boundary in Southern California. This is all part of the way this system has evolved. What I really want to try to take you through here is using this map as the backdrop. We're going to look at the connection of water supply, water demand, and water use, and the policy itself. Next slide, please. We'll start by looking at history. So on the vertical axis is the volume of water in millions of acre feet. And you may recall that 1 acre foot is about 326,000 gallons of water. You can quickly see when we're talking in millions of acre feet, it's hard to talk and get a good feel when you have to talk in trillions of gallons. So we'll stick with the acre foot volumetric unit for this presentation. On the bottom you see essentially 100 years of the recorded history. This is the length of our record in the Colorado River Basin in terms of actual measurements of water flows and water use. So what you'll see is 2 curves there. Hopefully you can see one in yellow and one in green. And I'm guessing without reading the legends you would be able to postulate which is water supply and which is water use. Of course, over time, the water use has been on a gradual and continual increase. Until most recently, there's a little downtick to it. We'll talk a little more about that as we go. And then the green line is the water supply. We have a 10-year running average on both of these just because it would be quite noisy if we were showing every year to year. As we go forward, we will show some of the annual variations. So as the little line says, we are here now, that's current time. Let's start first by looking back in time. And I think what we're going to see is an interesting relationship between, again, water policy, water supply, and water demand and water use. Next slide, please. All right, so if we start with that first time frame, and this is early, and remember again, we have a 10-year average, so the first year we're showing is 1914, essentially. On the top is the green line again, that's water supply, both the 10-year average and now you can see the variability year to year, and on the bottom is water use. There's one more line on the top set of graphs right below the green line, and that's a straight line, and that represents the average over the 109 years we currently have of the recorded record for water supply. Next, click please. So what happened in this time period? And what we're going to see as we walk through this is this interrelationship. We'll see there are times when water policy drove water use and water demand and water use. The opposite can also happen. Water demand and use can drive water policy, and that has happened many times in our past as well. Similarly, supply, we can see that water policy or water supply can absolutely drive water policy. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. We can also sometimes, at least a handful of times, we've seen that the water policy actually affected the supply, and I'll point out a couple of those as we go. Not yet, please. If you go back, so what happened in this period of time? We're in a relatively high flow period that is noted by the green line, and water demand is slowly increasing. This is actually water use that's being plotted. So the difference, again, use is what's really taken. Demand may be higher than use in the fact that there was more demand than what water was there. That's not the case in this early period of our history. So 2 big policy changes happened. First of all, the Colorado River Compact in 1922. The 7 basin states that touched this river system came together and to allocate the water supply. Now, why, given relatively low demand, did they want to do that? Well, there's an underlying framework here in Western water law that you're probably familiar with. I'll just touch on it, and that's the the doctrine of prior appropriation. And what that says is whoever got there first and put the water to a beneficial use gets a water right at that time. Everyone coming in after gets a water right that's of lower priority. And it's really stacked in many, many places exactly that way, just based on the time of your water right. So there was a lot of concern because there was one state developing this water system at the time. It was the state of California. There were people down at the bottom end of our river system who built a diversion dam, and they were diverting water out into California for agricultural use. That really led folks to say, wait a minute, we need our shares. We need to figure out how to set aside our water use, even though we're not going to put it to use yet. So this is a bit of a distinction from the prior appropriation doctrine, and it was implemented through a 7-state compact. What they did is they divided the basin into 2 parts, gave each part half the water they thought was available, 15 million acre feet. If you go back to that green line, you see they thought they had some slack there. The flows looked higher than that, and they knew Mexico would come a-calling, if I could use that term, someday. So they thought they'd built enough slack in by allocating 15 million acre feet to these 2 sets of basins. We were then authorized to build Hoover Dam. That was through the Project Act of 1928. That set those apportionments to the 3 lower basin states: Arizona, 2.8 million acre feet; California, 4.4; and Nevada, 300,000. As you can guess, the city of Las Vegas wasn't really in existence at that time. Next slide, please. And I'll just show you a quick, okay, yep, and one more click. So we'll go up in time. So again, we go to the next 30 years. We've now been authorized, and we build Hoover Dam. And the picture there on the top right is of the early construction of Hoover Dam. This is a unique facility in Western water and really water throughout the world. This was the first large dam built anywhere in the world on a totally uncontrolled river system. Many people thought it wouldn't stand the test of time, and please come visit sometime, and we'd love to show it to you. Also authorized was a canal, and that canal shown in the bottom right is what would allow water to be diverted out to those southern areas of California, again for agriculture. This isn't water going all the way to the coastal plain yet because that demand hasn't grown. So those are 2 key pieces of the policy that allowed those demands to increase, as shown in the bottom graph. Meanwhile, look what's going on with supply. Supply is actually lower, and that period of the 30s that we often call the Dust Bowl in the middle part of the country certainly was also a period where we weren't seeing the kind of flows that we're seeing in the early part of the century. Next one, please. Okay, in 1944, as depicted by those 2 flags, Mexico did in fact receive a treaty. And they received an allocation, an allotment of 1.5 million acre feet each year. Remember, previously the policy was set based on the historic record, albeit only a 20 or so year record, that people thought there was plenty of water to allocate both basins, the 15 million in total, plus Mexico, 1.5. So 16.5 million acre feet of water has been allocated for this system each year by 1944. As you can see also, if you go one more click, I think, Angela, thank you. The 4 upper basin states had not really divided their allocations. Remember, in the lower basin, the Basin Project Act of 1928, the Boulder Canyon Project Act, excuse me, of 1928 allocated the lower basin 7.5 million amongst each state. Again, an instance where policy is going to end up driving the water use and of all 3 states. In the upper basin, they're much slower to develop. And what they had decided by 1948 in their compact was not, let's don't allocate absolute volumes to each of our states because it's not that certain about what the water availability is. Let's allocate it by percentages. That way we can adjust as water supply adjusts. So a very interesting interaction, I believe, between policy and resulting water use and demand, in that they recognize to do it on a percentage basis. Next slide, please. Okay, further in this time frame, and this really was, as I would call it, the dam building era. We were building a lot of dams. In fact, Reclamation today has over 350 dams in its portfolio. Not all of them, of course, on the Colorado River. But a big piece of this dam building era was these last two legislative acts. The Colorado River Storage Project Act, which authorized the development of a series of dams in the upper basin states. And 4 of those dams have since been built. They actually authorized up to 10 or 12, as my memory serves me right. But the key one is Glen Canyon Dam. That's at the headwaters of the Grand Canyon, just upstream of us here, down here at Lake Mead. And a key piece of this construction and the reason this dam was built. That compact back in 1922 had this policy. It knew, as the upper basin states would develop their rightful shares, that the flow in the river going into Lake Mead and to the lower basin would be depleted. And there's a policy statement that says those upper division states, as they're referred to, will not deplete the flow below a certain running total, essentially, in every 10-year period. A very interesting, again, policy that was put in place to affect overall what the water use would be over time. Glen Canyon Dam is essentially the reservoir, the bank, so to speak, of water to allow the upper basin to continue to develop their rightful shares to the river system, while ensuring that they can meet that provision that they will not deplete the flow below this certain amount. And again, all of this, there's lots of detail. We'll try not to go into the detail unless there's questions, but a very interesting interaction again between policy and water use. Please. Rolling forward to that next period of time through 1980. So what's happened? We've built a lot of dams, particularly on this Colorado River system. We're moving more now out of the dam building era into an era of water management. And there was an interesting piece through this story that I've told so far. Back in that day of the compact, 1922, if you remember, all 7 states. One state never ratified the compact. We often call it a 7-state agreement, and today, of course, it is. But at the time, it went for a long period of time. And Arizona and California fought a legal battle over those allocations that came out of the Boulder Canyon Project Act in 1928. Remember, California got $4.4 million of the $7.5 million. Arizona got $2.8 million. So it finally got resolved, that litigation, in 1964 by the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court did a couple of things. It first said that it upheld those allocations of the legislation in 1928. That is, California would, in fact, have rights to 4.4 million acre feet, rights to 2.8 million acre feet, and Nevada to 3 million acre feet. This was a major piece of the river, because if you remember again in the prior Reclamation doctrine, which does still form the framework for all of this.
You are no longer muted. Have been muted. You can unmute your line by pressing *6. You are no longer muted. All guests have been muted. You are no longer muted. All guests have been muted.
Manu and Lisa, are you able to hear us now?
Yes, we got you back.
All right. Well, I apologize. I'll ask you if you could tell me when did we go silent?
You were describing how the Supreme Court upheld allocations.
Very good. All right. Well, we're pleased to be back from the dark side of the moon, and hopefully everyone can hear us. Yes, so this was an interesting connection to that prior appropriation doctrine. If you recall, whoever gets there first and puts the water to beneficial use then has that senior water right. The fight here was of that Arizona had not been able to put their water to beneficial use. And California argued that, that they really shouldn't have received the full 2.8 million acre-foot of allocation in 1928. The Supreme Court actually ruled that and upheld those allocations of the Boulder Canyon Project Act, and so I'm sorry, of the Boulder Canyon Act, and that Arizona would get their 2.8 million acre-feet. The Supreme Court also said that the Secretary of the Interior from that point forward would essentially be the water master in the lower basin. What that means is the Secretary would have the ability to determine when there is a normal condition, that is, all three states get exactly their apportionments, when there would be surplus water available during high flow periods, and also when there would be not as much water as those apportionments allow during times, as it termed it, of shortage. So the court itself set a policy here, and that policy was to allow an arbitrator, if I could use that term, the Secretary of the Interior, going forward, recognizing the volatility, obviously, of this system, also recognizing the increased demand for water that was likely to continue to occur in the lower basin. The other thing that's depicted there is more of a mechanistic part of the decree, but the decree asks the Secretary to each year submit to the court an accounting of all water use in the lower basin from the main stem of the Colorado. Our department here, our region, we're the implementing arm for the Secretary for all of these policies. And we have quite an elaborate real-time data collection and database storage and processing network in order to accomplish this. Next one, please, Angela. All right, moving on. Through the up to 1980s, recall again, we're coming out of the dam construction business, so to speak, but we've been authorized now to build the main diversion over to Arizona. The Central Arizona project was authorized in 1968 to move water to Phoenix and Tucson from the Colorado River main stem. A key piece of this legislation was, in order to get it through Congress, the Central Arizona project, that is the project in Arizona that would receive and allocate the water within Arizona, would be junior priority to all of California's 4.4 million acre-feet. An interesting twist in the history here, coming out of the Supreme Court decision, which said, yes, Arizona, you get your 2.8 to make the deal, so to speak, legislatively, in order to fund and have us build this project. This project agreed to be junior to all of California's 4.4 million acre-feet. That issue is a key issue we're still grappling with today, and we'll maybe have time to discuss that with questions. Next. Yes, please. Okay, now moving forward to the next time frame, 81 to 99. You'll see in the green line there, if you look, we were blessed with the highest flows on record in 1983, 84, and 85. And in fact, Hoover Dam's unregulated spillways flowed for the better part of a year and a half to move all of that water through the system. In order to move that much water, Dam was very intact. However, Glen Canyon Dam actually suffered some damage to their uncontrolled spillways. I don't have time to go through that. It's an interesting piece of history as well, but suffice it to say that we were able to move all this water downstream, but we had to flood lots of development downstream. As best we could, we controlled it, but all of that resulted in a policy, and the policy was the Colorado River Floodway Protection Act. And what that did, it provided relief, of course, to folks that were damaged. It also provided some policies that local governments could implement that would prevent development in as much development, at least, that had happened in the floodplain. So again, an idea of how supply really dictated policy. Unfortunately, we've never seen those flows in the past, and I say unfortunately a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Of course, we don't promote flood damage, and we do our best to avoid that, but we would sure like to see some higher flows on this system today. Also, what we saw was throughout the 70s and into the 80s was a real focus on environmental issues, and that came to fruition here in early 90s, 1992, with the Grand Canyon Protection Act. So again, remember Glen Canyon Dam's right upstream of the Grand Canyon. It's moving water downstream under the compact and other pieces of the law of the river, but how to move that water in terms of hourly and daily and even monthly releases became a real issue in terms of making sure that ecosystem has long-term viability. Again, something we don't have time to get into, but an interesting piece of the puzzle as it unfolded. Next, please. And finally, I want to bring up one other thing that happened in this period. Again, we're out of the big dam area of construction, era of construction, but we're focused on still constructing individual projects. And one of the projects we did construct was the Humid desalting plant. Congress actually authorized us to build that plant in the 70s for one reason, and that is we had very salty return flows on the order of 100,000 acre-feet a year coming from an irrigation district down near the border of Mexico. And when we put those flows back into the river, we exceeded a limit that we'd agreed to with Mexico on the saltiness or salinity of their water. This plant was to clean up those return flows. I bring it up because in times of drought, desalting plants have a great use, and we've seen that in Australia, if you're familiar with that example. However, now with the turnaround in that Murray-Darley system with high flows, I understand that many of the desalting plants they built aren't being used. A similar thing in some sense happened to us, but again, we didn't build this primarily for drought. We built it to clean up these salty return flows. Now, we had another way to get rid of that salt, and that was just bypass those flows into Mexico, and that's what we've been doing over all these years, but we don't get credit toward the Mexico delivery. Next slide. So let's take the last 15 years. So a piece of this law of the river that I didn't mention, that the policy very clearly stated, it came from the Supreme Court decree. The Supreme Court told the Secretary of the Interior that she could, in fact, make available one state's apportioned water to another state if that state didn't need it. Well, you now can recall probably that Arizona wasn't able to use its water because the CAP hadn't been built yet, and the Secretary utilized this provision in the policy to make that water available to California. Recall, and the little picture reminds you, California gets 4.4 million acre-feet a year from the system. Because Arizona wasn't using all of its water, California was taking between 5.2 and 5.4 million acre-feet a year, all through the 80s and 90s. So the provision was very clear. You don't get a permanent right to this water, but of course, again, the way this works, that policy drove increased water use to meet water demand. And by the late 90s, the Arizona project was coming online. It was clear Arizona would be able to take their full apportionment, and we had to be able to get California weaned off that extra water, if I could use that terminology. And we implemented 2 policies to do that. So again, now these are policies that are going to absolutely affect water use in the state of California. One was, recall the Secretary can determine when there's surplus water. We put some very precise guidelines to give California what we called a soft landing, a 15-year period that we could produce more, deliver more surplus water if we had it to them. And the quid pro quo was California agreed to implement agricultural to urban transfers, because the agricultural use in the state is about 3.8 of that 4 million, and of course the growth was in LA and San Diego. So that's what's called the Quantification Settlement Agreement. Won't go into much more detail, but a great example again of how policy was used to affect water use. The drought then hit, and you can see that very clearly again with the green and yellow curves. The drought hit, we went from nearly full. Our storage capacity basin-wide is 4 times the average annual inflow. We were at 95% full at the end of 1999. By 2005, we were about half full basin-wide in terms of water and storage. Our policy we call the Interim Guidelines. We actually got it implemented by 2007. It's a way to better coordinate the annual releases of those 2 big reservoirs, Lake Powell on the upper basin side, Lake Mead on the lower basin side. The key provision here is we now have guidance for the Secretary as to when she would declare shortages and by how much the lower basin states would be shortage and who would take those shortages. We have yet to implement a shortage. We are right at the line today. I mean, literally right at it. And, but given the recent inflows, we do not believe we would have a shortage in 2016, the first ever shortage. Again, I remind you. Next one, please. Then we set out to look at our initiatives with Mexico. Remember, Mexico gets 1.4 million acre feet. We've pretty much ignored them since 1944 because we're delivering their water with the exception of that issue of salinity I mentioned. It was very clear that the treaty says that under extraordinary drought, the U.S. could, in fact, reduce Mexico's yearly deliveries. Interesting fact, that's a State Department function, not a Department of Interior function. Proactively, we wanted to have an agreement with Mexico where, again, we would have a surety when they would take their reductions, and the quid pro quo is they share when there's surplus. That was also a provision of the treaty, and we codified that in these operating rules, so to speak. Another key piece of this is Mexico needs investment. They need investment in their infrastructure to become more efficient with their water use. The U.S., including water districts, not just the federal government, are investing in Mexico to help them line canals and do other conservation measures. And water is being exchanged based on that monetary investment. Mexico then, of course, gets the benefit of the long term of those efficiency improvements. Next one, please. All right, and the last one, we're still in a drought. And I think I'll just talk about this in our questions, given the time frame, with our little bit of setback with technology there. So let's just go forward. So hopefully we've been able to at least, again, talk to you about this evolutionary aspect of the law of the river and remind you again about this interaction between policy, supply, and water use and demand. So I take us back to that original picture, again, of the historical water supply and water use, and we ask the question, what does the future look like? And what should the policies be as we move into the future? That's really the fundamental question. So in 2012, we did what we call a basin study. We looked at scenario-based, took a scenario-based approach, and we looked at that in both in terms of projected water demand, which are yellow, and projected water supply, which are green. Again, these have 10-year running averages to make it a little easier to see. Lots of variability in supply. We did use 15 different climate models in order to produce those scenarios, as well as using history and tree rings, paleo reconstructions, as was mentioned earlier. So we had lots of ways of projecting scenarios into the future for water supply. For water demand, I'd be the first to point out that you see none of them decreasing. There are certainly some plausible scenarios out there where water demand could, in fact, decrease. Sometimes folks don't and aren't ready to talk about those. And so those scenarios were not absolutely included. Lots of discussion about them, but they weren't actually included in this study. So I guess I'll close with this and just tee up a couple of things. I think the fundamental question could be, how might this interaction between policy, supply, water use, and demand evolve in the future? More importantly, how should it evolve in the future? Certainly with regard to supply, we've had a policy in place since 1992 called Title 16, and what it is, it's a way that the federal government can help users with water reuse. So desal, conservation, water reuse. There are operating plants now within the state of California in the South where nearly every drop of water coming out of a water district is collected, cleaned up, and put back in the ground for future reuse. What should be the role of policy in promoting that kind of stuff? Similarly, with regard to supply, we've got a lot of interest in desal, as we've talked to, on the western coast of the United States and Mexico. What should be the role of policy in promoting that? Do we let market conditions just evolve over time? There's a bit of a market-based issue here or a system here, then that's how we're promoting essentially that transfer of the higher priority agricultural uses to the lower priority municipal uses. It's really market-driven San Diego's paying Imperial Irrigation District to do that. But should the market-based mechanisms be stronger? There's a myriad of questions like this. They will be answered. They'll be answered by many of you probably on this webinar. I would close by just saying this. Each of us have a very finite time, I would say, where we can affect policies such as this that may in fact have a lasting long-term effect. We have to take that very seriously. It is a legacy, and do our best in our time frame of 20 or 30 years. It's relatively short, but you think about those framers of the compact in 1922, what a framework they put in place that really has served us fairly well over the last 100 years nearly. I will stop there, Manu, and take any questions, and particularly starting with you, please add anything you would.
Thanks very much, Terry. That was as illuminating as I expected. I see some people are typing questions. So while they're doing that, let me throw one out at you. One of the things which connects to the very last few points you were making that I've been exposed to by some folks in California now is the doctrine of waste. Or in the California case, it's called the doctrine of reasonable beneficial use, whereas in the other states, it's being called the doctrine of waste. It's something that has not been brought in, but potentially could be a major enforcement tool to deal with a water rights system that many argue does not translate into the most economically efficient use of water. Do you have a view on this topic?
I think I want to make sure that I understood. With our line is a little statically, but I think you were using the the terminology doctrine of waste. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. I just want to make sure. I thought I followed you. Well, I will say certainly there is opportunity there to affect, for policy again, to affect how folks use water. In our system, I'll give an example. We have a policy in place that's regulatory. It's not by law, but it comes out of this concept of beneficial use. It's tied to the idea that the Secretary is the water master. And let me explain how it works. Each year, prior to the start of the year, all of our water users, number one, they have to have a contract with the Secretary of the Interior to take mainstream water from the lower basin of the Colorado River. And they submit what we call a water order. We have meetings with them. They explain how they got to their need of that water. They also show us what conservation elements they have in place. Everyone is required to have a conservation plan. We then, on behalf of the Secretary of the Interior, approve those water orders, and those water orders then are good for that coming year. Let me be honest and say this. To date, this has not been controversial other than one time when we went to court, and I won't go into the details of that. But I also want to point out that we have not been at the point in the past where we had to absolutely take a firm look at that water use in order to perhaps allocate or approve, is the right word, approve less than what the individual district has submitted as their water order. So I think that framework is somewhat in place. It's not been tested through courts. Other than one time we were sued by a determination where we did in fact reduce a water user's request. We resolved that outside of the court through that quantification settlement agreement, QSA. But I do believe this is a topic that deserves a lot of attention and a lot of discussion, particularly as we move forward.
Okay, there's 3 questions there. So maybe, can you see the chat window, Terry, or?
You could just read them? Sure.
Okay.
I'll have Angela
Maybe it's
assistant here
easier if
recently.
someone there reads them to you.
Okay, so question number 1 is from Yael Save Green. Thanks for the great talk. Could you address what led to the drop in water use in the early 2000s?
Absolutely. So a couple things were going on there. If you recall, coming out of the 1990s, we had pretty high flows. It's shown there. We had just put in place, and we're trying to put in place these guidelines for how to operate both in high and low reservoir conditions. We were making surplus water available in the early or mid to late 1990s. That continued that curve up a little bit, and then as we turned down, that was primarily due to the smaller availability of water. We did not have surplus water available. Now, it has in fact continued, and part of that is also due to conservation efforts in the lower basin. We have seen overall some reduction in use as we've gone through the period of the 2000s.
Okay, question number 2 is from John. Great talk, Terry. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about policies that could potentially fix the structural deficit out of Mead.
Okay, John, thank you for this, the question. Let me take a step back and explain quickly structural deficit. That's right, probably some on the phone aren't familiar with it. By the way we operate Lake Powell and Lake Mead, remember it's fairly complicated. I won't go to the details, but these guidelines set it on an annual basis, how much Powell will release to Mead and how much Mead will release to meet downstream demand. If we look at what has normally been Lake Powell's release since it first filled in 1980, that has a number. It's 8.23 million acre feet. The number isn't precisely that important, but that was the year-to-year release. If we receive that amount of water coming from Lake Powell and deliver our full 9 million acre feet of water to the 3 lower division states plus Mexico, and you do the evaporative losses and the side inflows, kind of that mass balance, what you find is Lake Mead puts out more than it takes in. I call it an imbalance at Lake Mead. Some have termed it the structural deficit. That was quickly what was meant by the question, and I think the question is what we're going to do about it. Is that correct? And I just want to make sure I heard the framing of it exactly.
Policies that could potentially fix.
Absolutely. So potentially fix it. So when you have an imbalance like that, what can you work on? You can work on the supply side, the demand side. Very clearly those two are both options. I think it's some combination. So let's talk about, for instance, the supply side. As we talked about a bit earlier, finding new sources of water, they'll be longer term because it takes longer to put those in place. Like, again, the easiest example is desal on the coast, whether it be Mexico or in the United States. Demand side. So there's lots that can be done on the demand side as well in terms of increasing water use efficiency that would result in reduced take out of the system. Certainly there's been an idea on the table for years, and that is the evaporative losses from Lake Mead are deemed or looked at this point as system losses, as a cost of doing business. If the drought continues, Lake Mead continues to fall, certainly looking at the other options on what to do with that big system loss will be discussed without a doubt.
Okay, Terry asks if there is any adoption of balanced water budget approach. It has worked in Santa Fe, for example. What are barriers to adopting where it's in place in California?
Okay, so I think that really ties almost back to the previous question from John about this imbalance. So I think the idea is, what do you do when your supply and demand are not in balance? Certainly what we're seeing in the state of California with mandated cuts to urban water use is a technique to control the demand side. Certainly we know throughout our basin there, and our study in 2012, this basin study was very clear with that, there are large remaining opportunities on the conservation side. The difficulty can be with the scope of those kinds of cuts. In California, that was statewide mandated. Governor has the power to do that and has in fact done that. More localized, and I think Santa Fe might be an example of that, but more localized, local governments can make that decision. So that's typically the rub, is what's the scope of that kind of activity to control demand? What will it be? Certainly, again, the Secretary of the Interior, is the water master down here in the lower basin, has quite a bit of authority, but I think I want to make it very clear. Our approach is one of collaboration. This secretary and previous secretaries typically do not take an authoritarian look at this on this river system, but rather we attempt to find solutions that everyone can agree to and are not mandated from the top down.
Okay, John Board, second, asks whether or not a full agricultural review has been done regarding crops and their appropriate location in the United States, i.e. growing rice in areas without water might not be wise. How much could be gained by optimizing in such a way?
Well, I don't think that there's been a holistic type of study basin-wide on that. Certainly our basin study looked at the use of irrigated agriculture. We stopped short, of course, of drawing a policy recommendation on what crops should be grown where. Let me just give an example. In the lower basin down here, and particularly down south of us, around the Yuma, Arizona area, that is an area where there are 4 growing seasons. Really, land is rotated more to rest the land than to take it out because of the weather and that sort of stuff. Now, what makes that work, of course, is the Colorado River water supply. A market-based system has, at that level of individual farming within water districts, has worked pretty well to drive, that is, that farmers grow what's going to be economically the most viable for them. It's I think worked fairly well. That's not to say that there aren't pockets where we could make an argument that perhaps different crops should be grown, but I think all of us, certainly in this country, have gotten used to having vegetables in winter, and quite a number of those certainly come from our area.
Okay, so Dr. Law also provided some feedback on that question.
Oh, very good.
Okay, Steve Burgess says, this system experiences multi-decadal fluctuations in supply. How do you incorporate that into the annual arrangements for supplying requested allocations?
The way we have done that to date has been based on our reservoir levels. We have mapped, so to speak, by looking at modeling scenarios in the future. We map then to rules or procedures that can be followed within the available information you have in near real time. I'll give you an example. In order to choose whether the Secretary will choose a shortage or not in the lower basin, we built into our operating rules a level at Lake Mead. It happens to be a certain elevation, but we said that in August, after the typical runoff season has happened, we'll project forward to January 1. We'll see where Lake Mead's going to be. The Secretary then will use that level, compare it to a pre-agreed to and defined trigger level, if I could use that term, and that sets that policy for that, or that decision under that policy for that next year. So I think it's always this bit of a trade-off of looking forward enough understanding what the future might look like and what the chances of certain things are, then mapping that into rules, quite frankly, a reservoir operator can follow. As you can guess, it's really important for us to not be tied up when we're trying to, in terms of not knowing what to do when we're operating these big reservoirs.
Okay, Kathleen Williams says some in Wyoming and other upper basin states maybe say they want to fully develop their allocation. Is that possible, or are there any constraints to that?
Well, I think, let me take the latter part of the question first. There's certainly constraints. Again, all the way back to the 1922 compact, if you recall, I had mentioned that that compact says upper basin states won't deplete the flow at a particular point on the river. It happens to be just downstream from Glen Canyon Dam, below some level, a running 10-year total or average, whichever you'd rather look at it. So that's absolute within the framework we have today, a constraint that would apply, could be a constraint to development in the upper basin to their full apportionments. Those states are very aware of it, and quite frankly, again, it's a particular reason that they allocated their water amongst the 4 states as percentages back in '48. That recognition of the variability of the system and that requirement to meet that compact provision. I think your first part was, can they develop to the full apportionment? I think what the upper basin states would currently tell you, and it's based on their latest study, which has been still a few years back, that likely 7.5 million acre-feet of water is not available in the system to the 4 upper division states. Any more questions?
No, no more questions.
Manu, I'll turn it back over to you. I appreciate all the great. I'm always a little hung up of not being able to dialogue with everyone, but I appreciate you all using the computer technology to have the conversation.
Thanks very much, Terry. This was a great seminar, and I think the encouragement I give to everyone is to follow up, because the kind of people we have had on this seminar series is unique. Often academics don't listen, and actually I noticed on this particular seminar, there are people all the way from China, and I know the individual, and I think there's strong interest in China in understanding what China should do about their water resources. So this is very nice that we can bring things together this way. And Terry, if you're available the next few weeks, I would love to follow up with you. And thanks to everyone else.
Absolutely. I appreciate that, Manu. I absolutely have the time and would love to follow up. This is something that obviously is very important to me and been a big part of my life. Be glad to, through you, provide my email address. We are on the website. If you just look for the Lower Colorado region, the Bureau of Reclamation, you would also be able to find my email address. If there are follow-up questions or dialogue to be had, I would appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks very much, guys. We managed to do this on time, which is also something to learn here. Thanks again, Terry, and be back in touch in the week.
All right. Thank you all for your interest.
Bye.